Hello, everyone. Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the podcast, my hoes. Welcome back to a special episode that people have requested for actually quite a while on here. Because I'm telling you this right now, when I went in to record and make this episode, or not record, write the episode on Teddy Roosevelt, Gabby looked at me and went, Stephen, are you sure you can do this? We don't really have a lot of time to do this. And I said, Gabby, I have been studying Teddy Roosevelt, the man, the myth, the legend, since I was like in 5th grade. This is a guy that I could name every single one of these stories by heart. I just really need to go back and confirm the dates on these. It's just, oh my God, he is easily my favorite US president of all time and easily one of my favorite figures in all of history. Absolutely. But I need to first go ahead and remind people that, hey, if you want to go on a trip with us, we are leading a trip to Germany this November. If you want to go and see castles, if you want to join us with Christmas markets, if you want to go and just have a fun adventure, just like what you do with Teddy Roosevelt, except in this case, probably with more drinking of mulled wine than shooting of animals, then you should join us to Germany. Gabby, don't look at me with judgment. I can see the look on your face. This is an amazing pitch that I am making here right now. My friends, that all being said, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode. So, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, this is the guy who entered the presidency as the youngest president in history of the United States at 42 years old. Weird thing about going into this, I thought for the longest time, because I guess I just never went back in and verified this fact, that it was JFK that was, the youngest president, because he's the one that everyone thinks about, right?
Isn't it Obama?
No, though Obama is actually, in terms of recent presidents, within I think he was in the bottom 5? No. Hold on. Can you look that up right now to verify? What rank is Obama in terms of age? I know that he wasn't old.
Okay. So, top 10 youngest
Youngest
US,
presidents.
yeah.
Okay.
First up, we have Millard Fillmore. He was 50 years and 6 months. Then
Okay.
James K. Polk, 49 years.
Okay.
James Garfield, 49 years, 3 months. Franklin Pierce, 48 years, 3 months.
Okay.
Grover Cleveland, 47 years, 11 months. Barack Obama, 47 years, 5 months.
Oh, so he was there.
Ulysses S. Grant, 46 years, 10 months. Bill Clinton, 46 years, 5 months. John F. Kennedy, 43 years and 7 months. Theodore Roosevelt, 42 years, 10 months.
Yes. Okay. So that's what it is.
So it was Theodore Roosevelt. He was the youngest.
And he doesn't look like he would be.
No, he doesn't. People really aged like milk back then.
Well, to be fair, considering the life of adventure and everything that he lived, the man was strong. There's a reason people called him the bull moose for stuff oh my God, this guy. Okay, so he was elected to the presidency, right? Well, no, he wasn't elected. He became president after William McKinley was assassinated, which that in and of itself is a whole fascinating story because he ends up getting killed by an anarchist that was determined to bring down the world. Which that's a whole thing with anarchy and specifically what they wanted to kill off all the rulers of the world. So royalty, presidents, literally anyone that could be in charge. It does not matter if you were good or evil or whatever. They saw just the position itself of having power as evil. So they wanted to kill you. They were batshit crazy. So yeah, he becomes president, not by virtue of election, but because he gets it after McKinley is assassinated. So technically JFK is the youngest elected president, while Theodore, of course, is the youngest actual president, even though he inherited the position. Anyway, this guy did so much stuff. I mean, we're talking about establishing several wildlife reserves, national forests, national monuments. He is the guy who is regarded as America's first modern president, one who is marked by great accomplishments that would benefit the United States and its people, and is easily one of the most impressive, and I'm going to say complex, and usually people use that term with a slight negative connotation, like the good and the bad. He has significantly more good, I would argue, than anything for bad. But I digress. We're going to need to get into this background. So, a family of fortune, beloved father, and determination to overcome childhood infirmities, this is something that would set Theodore Roosevelt on course to become the 26th president of the United States, which is an impressive start from the get-go. He was born into New York City's, one of its wealthiest clans on October 27th, 1858. As a child, he was called as sweet and pretty a young baby as I've ever seen. by his grandmother. Like, they loved him. Although, at the same time, his mother thought that he was a little bit more like a little turtle. This is something that is straight up from, like, the descriptions. He has so many books, like autobiographies and biographies that are written about him. There are so many different things that you can draw from when talking about this stuff.
Why did she think he was a turtle?
Well, the thing is, he was not exactly the healthiest kid. He was a guy who, when he was president, he was renowned for his vigor, his strength, literally getting shot in the chest and continuing to give a 90-minute speech when he was shot. Yeah, he was called the bull moose for a reason. The man was insane. Okay, I'm going to cite this here. I'm not saying this is a direct one-to-one quote, but I have to say this just because I know it's going to come up here at some point. With the assassination attempt upon Theodore Roosevelt, the doctor cited, I believe it was the little book that he had in his chest pocket that helped protect his heart, and also his ample chest muscle.
Ample chest muscle.
Yeah, the literal word for word from the doctor. Ample chest muscle. That is what saved his life.
Wow. No wonder you he resonates with you so much, because you too have ample chest muscle.
Yeah, when I was in Japan, for anyone who hasn't heard the story before, my nickname was Kiniku, which literally translates to chest meat.
Chest meat.
Because even if I don't exercise, I have an abnormally large chest. I'm built like a Dorito or an oversized dwarf, as I've been told.
Is that a medical diagnosis? Abnormally large chest. Maybe that's what he had too. Abnormally large chest.
Well, in his case, like, the thing about young Teddy, as he was before he was ever Teddy, and he hated this nickname. Funny little detail again. He hated the nickname Teddy. He didn't like any of this. Teddy, it's what he was called. He didn't like it.
He was just a little baby.
Yeah, he was so sickly that his parents did not think that he was ever actually going to survive past his 4th birthday.
Wow.
Like, that was actually the prediction, was that he was going to die by 4 years old. See, 3-year-old Teddy suffered horrifying asthma attacks that would strike without warning. He was propped up in a bed or a chair, and this fragile, little, terrified child would constantly feel like he was drowning and gasping for air. As he would say, quote, "I was a sickly, delicate boy, suffering much from chronic asthma, and frequently had to be taken away on trips to find a place where I could breathe." This is something that he would recall many times in his autobiography. So his father would do literally anything that he could to help the boy. They were rich, yes, so that's something that definitely helped, but he would take him anywhere and everywhere. Also, at the same time, any kind of possible medicine that you could get for this child, no matter what method it was, he would try it. And considering that we're talking about what is literally the Victorian era at this point, Gabby, you remember when we've gone over historical medicine, and you've looked at some of the methods that they had back in the Victorian era for what they would do for medical treatment.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's some of the ones that we had listed on this here. Doctors would administer electric shocks, controlled bloodletting, and massages that were so rigorous they made the boy's chest bleed.
Wasn't he 3?
3, yes.
And they just were electrocuting this 3-year-old?
Yes.
I love medical history.
And this would happen like from the time he was 3 to the time he was 13.
Wow.
This is what he had to deal with, right? They prescribed black coffee, cigar smoking, and even something called ipecac. I don't know. Gabby, can you look up what ipecac is? Like, I saw this in here, and I'm not even sure what that is.
It's a liquid you drink, and it makes you throw up. Yeah, it's a syrup.
To strengthen you.
So ipecac is a medication once used to induce vomiting. Its medical use has virtually vanished and is no longer recommended for routine use in toxic ingestion.
Oh.
So,
see, I knew about the vomiting thing. I was just wondering because it literally says that they did it to induce vomiting in the belief that food would place undue pressure on the lungs.
Because it would irritate the digestive tract. So it just made you throw up. How fun. How fun.
God, imagine force feeding a freaking, like, we have a 5-year-old daughter. Imagine force feeding a syrup to make them throw up.
Oh, she would hate that.
As they are suffering an asthma attack.
I mean, he lived.
Yeah, he did. But ultimately, these medicines did really nothing. Instead, the only thing that ever really helped him was his dad. His dad would hold him in his arms and would carry him upright every time he would struggle for air. As he would say, quote, "I could breathe, I could sleep when he had me in his arms."
Aw.
The elder Roosevelt would search far and wide for fresh air that could fill his son's lungs. He would take TD on year-long trips to Europe, on open carriage rides up and down Broadway on frosty nights. He would take him into the Middle East for the warm, dry air. He took him literally everywhere he could to try and find something that would help.
You know, when I'm feeling sick, you just don't take me to Europe.
Gabby,
And I think I would feel better.
Gabby,
Yeah.
considering that you feel sick every couple weeks, and we're in Europe pretty much, it feels like every couple months, considering what we've had to do for the last 2 years, you have no right to you have no leg to stand on when saying that.
But did it actually work? Like the places they took him to?
To a degree, yeah. Because, okay, think about this. You are in New York City in the 1800s. It is the Victorian period, which means rapid industrialization. How clean do you think the air is in these cities?
I'm pretty sure it was horribly polluted.
Yeah, that's right. It was. And so, ironically enough, for these things that they would try to do to remove people to find clean air, even with miasma theory and everything being a big thing at this time, which is wrong, but also you do want to remove people from being around constant pollutants, there was an idea in there that would actually help you. So yes, going out into the countryside did give better results than being stuck inside of a smog-ridden city.
Makes sense.
Yep. So, okay, the other thing that would happen that his father would end up inspiring him to was he would develop a philanthropic spirit. Like, Teddy would watch his father as he grew up, not only just take care of him, but every single person that he would ever meet. He would donate his time and money to poorhouses and orphanages. He would found the New York Museum of Natural History, and he would attend one, if not two, religious services every single Sunday. Like going there not just once, oftentimes he would go there twice. And after church every week, TD would vie for his father's approval by trying to outdo his siblings by memorizing 2 Bible verses and writing the best summary of the day's sermon. He could not yet be the strong and healthy son his father wanted, but he had learned that the road to his father's favor lay not with strength, but with piety. And that's something that would stick with him for a long time. Teddy was determined to grow up to not just be great, but to specifically be good. A moral person. The big problem is that, as I said before, he was weak. And that was going to be an issue. But even if he lacked physical strength, this little wisp of a boy, he had so much intellectual capability. He was abound in intellectual power. Oftentimes he was confined to his bed. And so the curious little TD would end up being tutored at home, and he would find companionship on the bookshelves of his family library. Quote, as he gasped for breath, Roosevelt kept going by reading avidly, especially the adventures that featured struggle and triumph against danger by larger-than-life heroes. This comes from a history of Theodore written by Dalton. Oh, God, what was his name? Kathleen Dalton. That was it. Okay, this kid, even though he was weak, he threw himself into his studies. But not only that, you know how I said that his father did that whole thing for like the Natural History Museum and all that stuff here with New York?
Yeah.
So the big thing that he wanted to do is he wanted his own kind of zoo, his own menagerie. Gabby, I want you to imagine our daughter doing this. He collected and taxidermied specimens. Not just dead things, though, right? He kept even live animals. His menagerie would include snapping turtles, a family of gray squirrels. He kept live mice in his shirt drawer and dead ones in the icebox.
Okay, that's kind of cool, though.
Yeah.
That's something I would have done. Probably not the mice, but everything else.
Yeah, so he was collecting every kind of species that you could possibly imagine that he could get his hands on, having them taxidermied, and then, keeping them for study.
He's a little scientist.
Yeah. No, I kid you not. Literally, by the age of, 11? Yes, by the age of 11, he had collected over 1,000 different items of this type of stuff, which he referred to as, quote, the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And he is an 11-year-old boy. Like, the thing is, as Kathleen would say, he went into nature in order to learn scientific facts because science was the new truth of this age, and it shaped his view of the world as much as any other set of ideas. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be able to learn and study everything. Now, as TD's teen years approached, his father would challenge him, saying, and this is easily one of the most badass quotes I could possibly imagine, while still simultaneously not being very forceful. He would say to the boy, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body."
What did he mean by make your body?
You know how there's that whole expression of get good?
Yeah.
Think of it like that, of stop being weak. In order to be strong, you must make yourself strong.
Interesting.
This was something that would inspire him. Like, he was never the kind of guy who was going to just sit there and not do anything. He was a human whirlwind, all right? Idleness was not something that would ever actually sit by him. That was an enemy. So Roosevelt would throw himself into exercising, into physical activity, into literally anything that you could imagine, all in an effort to surpass and surmount his limitations. He wanted to remove, like, this is the equivalent of, think of a person who has been horribly injured in an accident, right? And they are now in physical therapy. And there are some people who just give up. And then there are others who, even when they've lost the ability to walk, they force their body to do all these exercises to walk. To now it's gotten to the point that some people are able to get back limited degrees of mobility because it like retrains the body to be able to walk again. This is what I'm talking about. He would pour hours into hanging from gymnastic rings and parallel bars. He took boxing lessons from prize fighters. He would visit the nearby gymnasium every single day to lift weights. He did every single thing he possibly could to strengthen himself. When he was 13 years old, he received his first gun. And the funny thing was, he was extremely nearsighted, basically blind. He couldn't shoot straight. And after failing to even see the letters on a distant billboard that his friends were reading, Roosevelt would go and receive his first pair of glasses, which opened his eyes in more way than one, as he would say, "I had no idea how beautiful the world was until I got those spectacles." Literally, it's like he had no idea that the world wasn't supposed to look like that. If anything, it's kind of similar to what happens with you every time you get in the car and you remember your glasses and you're like, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
I can see."
Seeing the definition of leaves, like, you don't think about that. If you can't see it, you're like, oh, the green blob is a tree. But then you put your glasses on, you're like, oh my gosh, the leaves. It's you really gotta experience it to
It's
understand.
stunning, especially for him. Like, I completely get it. So Roosevelt does this, and his asthma attacks never completely abate, but they do subside. Although they might have naturally ebbed as he grew towards adulthood, Roosevelt would credit his vigorous exercise regimen, which bolstered his belief in the value of hard work, that if something is wrong with you, you just need to work to fix it. Having been taught that exercise and outdoor living would build character, and having seen the impact that they had on him, Roosevelt would extol the doctrine of a strenuous life, as he would call it in an 1899 speech. Like this, if you want to give the definition of a self-made man, Roosevelt, with the exception of coming from a wealthy family, he physically made himself
Okay.
into something that is different.
Not to be political, but
We're not talking
yes,
financial.
I
We're
know,
not talking financial.
I know. But what I'm saying is, yeah, he's self-made, but he had the resources to be, because if you come from a wealthy family, you're not spending all your extra time trying to survive. So he didn't have to spend all of his time focusing on just basics.
You
He
are
could
right.
work out as much as he wanted because he probably didn't have to have like additional jobs to support himself, you know? So it does change things a little bit.
you-
Like, yeah, he
you are
made
right.
himself into that, but he had the means to do so.
Yes, and you are right.
So that. I just want to point that out because, yeah, he made himself into someone, but he wasn't struggling.
You are right. This isn't the same kind of thing of someone who could say, oh, literally anyone could do it, because it's like you do have to have certain things set up in order to be able to, but it does prove that something like it is possible.
Yeah, but you need the resources to make it possible, and not everyone has those resources.
Yes. Yeah. So he would say from this that the highest form of success comes not to the man who desires mere easy peace, but to the man who does not shrink from danger, from hardship, or from bitter toil. This is what brings us to the next point. Roosevelt, as he would grow older, would go off to study, and he would do so at Harvard in 1876, while challenging himself physically by playing sports, by hiking, going on hunting trips during school breaks, anything that he possibly could. During his sophomore year, Roosevelt, though, would be dealt the first major tragedy of his life with the death of his father from cancer at age 46.
No.
Roosevelt had said that his father was the best man that he ever knew. This would hurt him, but he would be able to move on. During his time at Harvard, Roosevelt would begin to court Alice Hathaway Lee, and the two would end up getting married in 1880. As a newlywed, Roosevelt began to purchase acreage in Oyster Bay, New York, where generations of his family had vacationed, and he planned to build a home that would eventually become Sagamore Hill, his main residence for the remainder of his life. Roosevelt's political career would also begin during this period, as he was elected to serve his Manhattan district in the New York State Assembly. Now, on Valentine's Day in 1884, this would be arguably the worst moment of his life. Roosevelt would suffer the double loss of both his mother and his wife, who had given birth to his first child, Alice, literally 2 days earlier. So his wife gave birth to his daughter, and then she and his mother died at basically the same time, like literally the same time. As he would say in his diary, "The light has gone out of my life." And that was the only thing he wrote in his diary for that day.
How did they die?
The wife died from complications due to childbirth, and then the mother was sick. And it's just a coincidence then that they died on literally the same day.
Wow, that's sad.
Yeah. So 3 days after the double funeral, Roosevelt would return to Albany and would pour himself into legislative work because it was all that he could do, moving 21 bills out of committee in a single day, saying, quote, "I think I should go mad if I were not employed." That's really all he could do, throw himself into his work. The devastated Roosevelt, however, would refuse nomination for a fourth term. He simply couldn't do it anymore. And so, leaving his daughter in the care of his sister, Anna, he would instead travel to the Badlands of the Dakota Territory in order to live and work as a rancher, believing that hard work would keep him from depression. He went and acquired the Maltese Cross and Elkhorn ranches outside of the small town of Medora, where he would round up cattle while working alongside his hired help. Residents were initially wary of this Harvard-educated Easterner, but he endeared himself to the people by keeping up with the tiring labor of ranching. This was never a guy who was like, "Oh yes, let the hired help deal with it. I'm not going to do it." No, he was working right there alongside them every day, the dirtiest jobs, anything that he could. He was going to do it himself. And for the first time in his life, the very elite Roosevelt would mix regularly with the common folk, and the experience would humble him. He would say, "Had it not been for the years spent in North Dakota and what I learned there, I would not have been the president of the United States." It was something that really helped him to understand the common man. While in the West, Roosevelt began to publish a trilogy of popular books about his experiences, including Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, and The Wilderness Hunter, which is something that would cement his reputation as an author. In all, over the course of his life, he would write 30 books, with many of these being inspired specifically by his actions as a rancher, hunter, and frontiersman, so to speak. Of course, I mentioned these books, and I have to tell a story from one of them because, again, this is quite literally one of my favorite stories of anything to have to do with Teddy Roosevelt. Gabby, have you heard of the boat thief story?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. This is a fun one. And I'm sure that for many of you who are probably listening to this or watching this right now, you may have already heard the story yourself, but there's a lot more detail about this. And it's just, oh my God, this is such a fun one in here. Because if this does not sum up Teddy Roosevelt to a man, I don't know what does.
Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, eBay Motors. eBay Motors is here for the ride. Remember when you first saw the potential, and then through some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own? With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, exhaust kits, turbochargers, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
So by early 1886, Teddy Roosevelt had settled into the life as a deputy sheriff and cowboy at his Elkhorn Ranch near what is now Medora, North Dakota. One February morning, a ranch hand came running up to report that someone had stolen their one and only boat. Now, that boat was Roosevelt's only means to cross the swollen Little Missouri River in order to look after the horses who were wintering on the opposite bank. That's it. That is literally all that they had. That could be a death sentence for a rancher. Now, Roosevelt had a pretty good idea about who was actually behind the theft. There were these three, quote, hard characters that belonged to a class that always holds sway during the raw youth of a frontier community, and the putting down of which is the first step to decent government. This being according to Roosevelt's 1888 memoir, The Life and Hunting Trail. In other words, there were like three rapscallions living in the hills that if you were going to have a modern and civilized state, these were going to be the first people that you had to catch and get rid of. So yes, the men were living 20 miles upriver from Roosevelt's ranch, and their leader, a guy by the name of Mike Finnegan, was a big man with shoulder-length red hair and a penchant for gunfights, according to Roosevelt. He was, in every sense of the word, a ruffian. The three were known as cattle killers and horse thieves. The bandits were looking to leave the area, where a band of vigilantes known as the Stranglers were busy hanging lawbreakers, especially horse thieves. So they were trying to get the boat and get out.
So you could be hung for stealing horses, and that was legal?
Oh my God, yes. You can, no, technically they're talking about vigilantes. The whole thing for like people catching someone and hanging them, that's not legal. It wasn't, but that's why the whole point of it's vigilantes. It's people outside of the law.
But then don't they get arrested?
Generally speaking, in these kind of areas, no one would ever punish them for this stuff. It's one of the same reasons as to why, okay, so think on it like this, and this is a completely opposite side of the spectrum when I'm talking this, horribly different thing. But remember how in the South there was a whole bunch of things with lynchings? Like, as an example, a black man would be accused of rape or something, and then a white mob would show up and lynch him in a form of vigilante justice?
Yes.
Okay, so in the event of actions where this stuff would actually occur, that's illegal. Like, even in the South, even considering laws, people were not allowed to do that legally. They still did, and oftentimes local authorities would just go, we don't care.
Wow.
And that same kind of thing could be applied to horse thieves and cattle thieves and all that kind of stuff out west. Generally speaking, when you had bounties on you and you were, God, why am I fumbling for words when I'm saying this? You've seen it in old Western films and stuff where they have pamphlets. Yes, that's the word. Pamphlets and posters that say wanted, dead, or alive.
Yeah.
Think of it like that. So technically speaking, the hanging of them and other stuff, like that wasn't something that you were supposed to do in an execution. But if you got in a gunfight with them, trying to capture them, and then, turned in their dead bodies to the authorities, no harm, no foul.
Interesting.
So that was the whole point. Dead or alive. Now, the boat thieves, in this case, were smart. They had taken the only means by which they could be pursued, the boat. It was February, and chasing them overland would have been nearly impossible because of the winter weather and massive ice flows that littered the riverbank. So now two of Roosevelt's ranch hands, a guy by the name of Wilmot Dow and William Sewall, who were originally from Maine and skilled boat builders, they immediately got to work and they threw together a flat-bottomed boat in literally just 3 days. Now, you think, okay, awesome, they have a boat now. They don't need to worry about this. Yes, the ranch thieves stole their boat that they had before, but now they're going to be able to take care of their horses. It's not a problem. They can get on with their lives. Oh, no. See, Roosevelt was glad to have these men who he would call quick as cats, right? Strong as bears and able to travel like a bull moose. And he was going to use them to chase down the thieves. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that it's like they now had a boat. No. They couldn't just let the three men get away with their crime. Roosevelt believed that to submit tamely and meekly to theft is to invite the most certain repetition of the offense. In other words, you let these thieves do it once, they're gonna do it again. And he wasn't gonna let them do it again. Besides, he was, at this time, technically speaking, a deputy sheriff, and he had a duty to catch criminals. Maybe also a little bit of a personal vendetta, but a duty. It was his job. And they stole from him, so it's fair game. So for 3 days, Roosevelt and his men went and pursued the thieves. They braved bone-chilling weather, giant ice flows. They lacked fresh food to keep them going. And also, there was the possibility that they could be surprised by the men while they were hunting and trying to actually catch something. But on the afternoon of the third day, coming around a bend, they spotted his stolen boat tied up on the riverbank next to another flat-bottomed boat, per the National Park Service. Roosevelt and his men quietly made their way towards the smoke from a campfire with their weapons at the ready. When they neared the camp, they saw that there was only one man there with his gun at his feet. They could surprise him. So they quickly took him into custody without a fight, and then they waited for the other two thieves to return from hunting. Now, Roosevelt heard them coming from a long way off. They entered the camp, rifles over their shoulders, the steel barrels glinting in the sunlight, and he immediately stepped up to them, pointed their guns, and demanded that they put their hands up. Immediately, one of the men obeyed, but their leader, Finnegan, he hesitated, thinking over, whether or not he'd be able to actually take on Roosevelt. He was curious about his chances in a shootout. But Roosevelt, with his gun pointed at him, slowly walked towards him. He cursed, and then realizing he'd been beaten, set down his rifle. He caught them. Now, Roosevelt had captured the boat thieves. But where are they, Gabby?
In the middle of fucking nowhere.
Yes, literally in the middle of effing nowhere, in the wilderness of Dakota Territory. Everything is freezing. It is barren. They can do literally nothing. There is not a sign of civilization with a proper jail cell for many, 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 many miles. So what are they going to do? Well, he had to get them to a town that had a jail, and that was going to be much harder than just simply tracking them down. They had to keep a perpetual guard of the prisoners, which meant that Roosevelt and his two men were only able to sleep in shifts. Additionally, Roosevelt believed that if they tied the prisoners up, it was so cold that potentially they could lose their hands and feet to frostbite. So he would volunteer to take the first shift, trying to stay awake, his shotgun leveled on the men as they all huddled near a roaring campfire. The next day, they would journey downriver, but soon they would run into another problem. The river became choked with ice and was not passable. So for 8 days, they camped out, waiting for the ice to thaw. As he would say, quote, "There is very little amusement in combining the functions of a sheriff with those of an Arctic explorer." But this is, again, I love his memoirs. They're so much fun. But they were in Sioux country, and game was scarce. Soon, they were reduced to eating unleavened bread. And so to pass the time, the men, including the prisoners, would read. Roosevelt would work his way through Anna Karenina, which was according to a letter that he wrote to his sister, and the prisoners, who had a large stack of books with them, would read about Jesse James and novels about high society back east. They literally were just it's a jail reading session, and that's all they could do. Eventually, they would manage to pass this, and they would reach a ranch where they were able to borrow a wagon and a driver. While Dow and Sewall would continue downriver with the boats, Roosevelt would take the prisoners to Dickinson, trudging through thick mud behind the wagon that carried the prisoners. 300 miles from where Roosevelt began his adventure. And remember, this is the late 1800s at this time. He turns the men over to the sheriff and receives $50 for bringing them in, which is about $1,500 in today's term. That is not worth what it is that he did, mind you.
What do you mean? Sheriffing and Arctic exploration? I think 1,500 is more than enough.
Considering his, everything that he owned and everything that he did, yes, it's a welcome payment, but simultaneously, that does not even come close to covering the cost incurred for everything that he did.
He also got the satisfaction of bringing them in, taking them down, getting vengeance.
That was literally it. That is what he wanted. So yes, the payment helped, but he did that specifically for the principle of the thing. Remember how I tell you all the time when I'm doing things where you're like, why would you do that? That is pointless. That's so dumb. And I say, no, it's the principle of the matter. I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
That is what I am talking about. So a court would later sentence Finnegan, the ringleader, along with another of the thieves, to 25 months in prison. The third man ended up having his case dropped, and Finnegan would end up later writing to Roosevelt from prison, saying, "I have read a good many of your sketches of ranch life in the papers since I have been here, and they interested me deeply." He even invited Teddy Roosevelt to come to the jail and visit him if he ever got a chance, because he just liked him so much. Teddy Roosevelt, though, would go on soon to other adventures. His life as a Western rancher would end due to the fact that, remember, this is the Dakotas, and devastating blizzards would end up costing him the majority of his cattle herd and force him back to New York year-round. Literally, he was over there, I'm not going to say the term playing rancher, but he kind of was. Like, he didn't need to be there for the money. He did it specifically for the fun and the labor, basically.
Because he had hobby money.
Yeah.
Be so for real. If I could afford to, I would be in the Dakotas as a cattle rancher right now.
Yeah.
I'd just be fucking around, just me and some cattle. Maybe some Great Pyrenees dogs, like 5. Just 5.
I get that. Hey, that's pretty much what he did. And then a blizzard came in and pretty much destroyed all of it. I can't remember how many cows he had. I think it was like, was it 200? 2,000? He had like a good amount of cattle, and 90% of them or something got wiped out.
Yeah, the cold will do that, but society yearns for cattle ranching.
Hold on. No. It's like the children yearn for the mines. What is it in this case? The
millennials yearn for the ranch.
The millennials yearn for the ranches.
Well, technically, we're like millennial, Gen Z, Zillennial.
Zillennial.
The Zillennials yearn for the ranch.
So an appointment to New York's police commission in 1895 would draw Roosevelt back to Manhattan. He was given a mandate to reform a police force that, oh my God, I could do an entire episode on the history of police in different places, like in the case of Chicago, New York, and others. You want to talk about a force that is rife with a history of corruption, bribery, and all kinds of other issues, and you got that here, right? So Roosevelt was determined that he was going to remove corrupt law enforcement officials and then also conduct midnight rambles in order to check that city cops were actually making their rounds. Because here's a problem, Gab. Here was a literal problem they faced. You know how people are supposed to go on night patrols to really go and make sure that everything is safe?
Yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of those cops that were supposed to be doing that at the time would literally just go to a bar or something and get drunk for the rest of their shift and not actually be out on patrol. So Roosevelt, as the frickin' commissioner here, would just go out for midnight strolls, basically, to make sure that people were actually doing their jobs and patrolling the streets. Really good on him in that case. But yeah, that is straight up something that he did. Sometimes he would go out joined by press and also a photographer and social reformer, Jacob Riis. Now, Roosevelt would see firsthand how the other half, which was the poor and the foreign-born, lived. Because remember, this is New York City, meaning it's a ton of, say, the Italians would actually come over after this. It's mostly Irish at this time, if I recall correctly. It's largely Irish people at this point in New York. A lot of Irish and also African American. And as he would say about the situation, my whole work brings me in contact with every class of people. I get a glimpse of the real life of the swarming millions. Now, if he was going to tame a city that was teeming with vice, he was going to have to be drastic. So he reinstituted the daytime use of the nightstick, which had previously been removed for its brutality. In other words, he wanted to bring back the stick that cops would beat people with to get them back in line.
Why?
Because this is the late 1800s in New York. Shit is dangerous. And by he wanted to make sure that he could break the criminals of this city. And that's what he wanted to do. He also made sure to arm the police with a standard gun. He attempted to enforce all of the city's laws, even ones that prevented the sale of alcohol on Sunday. But this was something that had been flagrantly violated for years, thanks to police officers being able to be easily bribed, and also by different political machines that would help things along with illegal saloon operations, essentially. Now, Roosevelt didn't agree with the law, thinking that it was altogether too strict, but remember, this is Roosevelt. It's the principle of the thing that matters. And so he was going to enforce it even if he didn't agree with it. The attempt to shutter Manhattan's 15,000 saloons on Sunday, on the Sabbath, this angered a lot of people, especially German immigrants who frequently would go to these on their one day off they would get. Because remember, late 1800s, labor laws aren't exactly good at this point. Tens of thousands of these would protest Roosevelt in the street, in rallies, and even 2 pipe bombs end up getting mailed to him. But he would say, and I quote, "I would rather see this administration turned out for enforcing the laws than succeed for violating them." In other words, he didn't give a shit if he got kicked out of office, right? He was going to enforce the law rather than just let the law be violated and thus, as a result, stay in office. He didn't give a shit about being popular. He was going to do what was right. Ultimately, he would leave the job after 15 months in order to make whistle-stop campaign speeches for the Republicans' 1896 presidential candidate, William McKinley, saying, "This is the last office I will ever hold." He predicted to a friend, "I have offended so many powerful interests and so many powerful politicians." You may wonder, why would that be the case? Why would that be the last thing that he would ever do? Because interesting position. You know how when we talk about politics and politicians and people talk about the president, but very few people mention the vice president?
Yeah.
For many people throughout history, it's only recently that vice presidents have really gone on to win the presidency more, I guess, or have really had more of a chance to, like in the case of Biden and others. But usually a person who became vice president, that was the end of their political career.
Why?
They just didn't have the political clout to get more. Also, it was seen as unbecoming in many areas that, oh, if you were a vice president, you already achieved a high office. So the fact that you're trying to go for president may make you seem like a power mongerer, like a person who is just trying to really get ahead rather than do their duty.
Weird.
Yeah, a bit of a weird thought, but that's how it was seen at the time. And so if you were put on the up as vice president, this means that was basically the end of your political career. Like, that was it. So people, specifically the political forces of New York, made him be vice president. He didn't want to be vice president. He didn't want to go on to this. The political forces of the city basically pushed him onto the ballot to get rid of him. That's literally it. And so it was seen like, oh, you go and be vice president, that's going to be the death sentence of your political career. You're over. You're not going to be our problem anymore. That was it. That was it. Roosevelt's unique combination of progressive and law and order credentials would position him for higher offices, though. It wasn't going to be long before he was going to have an even greater position. Now, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves when I say that. He had many more accomplishments besides what he would later do as president, which we will be getting to here in a moment. Not vice president, president. Among his many lifetime accomplishments, few of these would capture the imagination, though, as much as his early military service as a Rough Rider during the Spanish-American War. Do you remember that phrase for a Rough Rider?
Is that like a condom brand?
Okay, I don't even know how to respond to that. No, Gabby, Rough Rider, wait.
Yeah, the original studded condoms. Rough Rider, studded condoms.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's a thing.
That's a thing? Where is that a thing?
You could get them on Amazon in a 24-pack.
Gabby, what is the image that is on those condoms? What does it look like?
The box has...
Please tell me it's a face of Teddy Roosevelt on them. Please.
No, it's a blonde girl in a blue outfit.
Oh, that is not what I expected at all in that scenario. Weird. Okay. But dang, I didn't realize that. Okay, that's funny. But no, the Rough Riders is really a hilarious story when talking about his military career, which was not really much in the first place. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt was a sheriff. He was an accomplished politician. He was a great personal fighter, but he was never...
He was an author and he was a rancher.
Yes, but he was never a military guy. That's the thing. He never was. Until this event. See, The Spanish-American War is a very complicated issue because America had become interested in Cuba's liberation in the 1890s, as publications would oftentimes portray the evil of Spanish rule. No one favored Cuban independence more than Roosevelt. And as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he would beat the war drum constantly and prepared the Navy for war with Spain. The battleship USS Maine was then dispatched to Havana, Cuba, and after a few quiet months anchored in the Havana harbor, the Maine suddenly exploded, killing 262 American sailors. Now, Spain would deny ever blowing up the Maine, but a U.S. investigation would conclude that the explosion was caused by a mine. That's not true, and I know that there's going to be a whole bunch of people in the comments of this on YouTube and others who are going to say, oh, no, it wasn't actually caused by a mine, it was this. Yes, we know. But at the time, U.S. forces specifically pushed the narrative that it was caused by a mine. The political class would use this as an excuse to start a war. And a war would happen. Now, ultimately, Roosevelt would serve gallantly during this very brief conflict, which would only last from May to July of 1898. A very eager Roosevelt would resign his post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he would petition the Secretary of War, Alger, to allow him to form a volunteer regiment. Now, although he had 3 years of experience as a captain with the National Guard, he would defer leadership of the regiment to Leonard Wood, who was a war hero with whom he was very friendly. Wood, as colonel, and Roosevelt as lieutenant colonel, would then begin recruiting and organizing the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. This is where it gets really funny. They would sort through 23,000 applications in order to form the regiment. That means out of 23,000, they were only going to form a force of 1,000. Roosevelt's fame and his personality would turn him into the de facto leader of this ragtag group of people, which I say ragtag, you're like, okay, hold on. Aren't they going to be recruiting from a whole bunch of people? Yes, they are. And guess who this is composed of? Polo players, hunters, cowboys, Native Americans, athletic college buddies. Literally all the... I want you to imagine this. The Rough Riders are what would happen if you had a fraternity go out into the country and start recruiting guys that they had tryouts for. That's basically what the Rough Riders were. And that is how they were born. The native part is something that I really do have to mention in here as well because I find fascinating. There's a direct quote from one of his books about the Rough Riders when talking about their participation. Quote, "From the Indian Territory, there came a number of Indians, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Creeks, and only a few of these were of pure blood. The other, in other words, they're, pure Native American. The others shaded off until they were absolutely indistinguishable from their white comrades, with whom, it may be mentioned, they all lived on terms of complete equality. One of the gamest fighters and best soldiers in the regiment was Pollock, a full-blooded Pawnee. He had been educated, like most of the other Indians, at one of the admirable Indian schools, which have added so much to the total of the small credit amount which the white race balances the very unpleasant debt of the dealings with the Reds. Pollock was a silent, solitary fellow, an excellent penman, much given to drawing pictures." Which I'm going to need to explain a little part of the thing that he says in here about the whole thing with the native schools. Gabby, you remember how there's a lot of the really effed up history when it comes to the Native American schools and what it did to people?
Yeah, those boarding schools.
Yeah, the boarding schools. So what Roosevelt has been saying in here, or what he was saying, is that they were a good thing, but they were a good thing in the sense that it was something that had to be done to help them to pay back the debt of how many times they had been screwed over. Because he fully acknowledged, yeah, the red men got the raw end of the deal. As he would say here, they were screwed. So it was their duty to help them because they had really effed them over.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the Rough Riders would participate in 2 important battles in Cuba. The first action they saw occurred at the Battle of Las Guasimas in June 24th, when the Spanish were driven away. The Rough Riders would lose 7 men with 34 wounded. Roosevelt himself would narrowly avoid bullets buzzing by him into the trees, which in turn would shower splinters down around his face. He would lead the troops in a flanking position, and the Spanish would ultimately flee. American forces then assembled for an assault on the city of Santiago through the San Juan Hills. Colonel Wood was promoted in the field, and in response, Roosevelt would happily write, "I got my regiment." Now, the Battle of San Juan Heights was fought on July 1st, which Roosevelt would call the great day of my life. He would lead a series of charges up Kettle Hill towards San Juan Heights on his horse Texas, while the Rough Riders would follow behind him on foot. He rode up and down the hill, encouraging his men with the orders to march, and he would kill one Spaniard with a revolver salvaged from the Maine. Other regiments would continue alongside him, and the American flag was ultimately raised over San Juan Heights. Hostilities would cease shortly after Santiago fell to the siege, and the Treaty of Paris would give the United States its first possessions: Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The war itself had lasting impacts. The splendid little war, as Roosevelt would call it, would last 10 weeks. It destroyed the Spanish Empire and ushered in a new era of American empire. Roosevelt's political career ignited as he returned home a war hero and a national celebrity. He charged on horseback to victory at Kettle Hill and collectively San Juan Heights, and would continue riding that horse all the way to the White House just 3 years later. Going back home and elected governor in 1898, Roosevelt would sign nearly 1,000 bills into law, including those that taxed corporations, limited work hours for women and children, preserved forests, and also improved sweatshop conditions. The interesting thing about all this is that Roosevelt's refusal to hand out patronage jobs and his support of taxation bills would end up chafing the state's Republican Party boss, Thomas C. Platt, whose political machine had put him into office in the first place. And so, unable to control Roosevelt, Platt would conspire to move him out of the governor's office by instead maneuvering him into what Roosevelt considered a useless position: Vice President of the United States. Ironically, Roosevelt would ultimately succeed by making him so obnoxious to the greedy, the corrupt, and the powerful that they would promote him in order to get rid of him. Roosevelt would reluctantly agree to accept the nomination as McKinley's running mate in the 1900 election. And less than a year later, after McKinley was assassinated by a gunman at the Pan American Exposition, this means that the 42-year-old Roosevelt, who was never supposed to be there in the first place, became the youngest president in American history. He would take the oath of office, fittingly, in his home state of New York. Now, here's what you gotta understand. The legislative branch held the most power compared to the other government branches prior to the 20th century, and even still to this day technically does. Roosevelt would turn a new leaf in the government because he would take advantage of all of his executive powers. This transformed the role of the executive branch. He wanted to expand foreign relations to make the U.S. a global power, and also direct his attention to social and economic issues that the country was facing at the time. Conservation and preservation of the nation's natural resources were also at the forefront of his concerns. Roosevelt would inherit a new kind of nation when he first entered office. The U.S. had just acquired the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico following the Spanish-American War, and with these new territories meant that there was significantly more responsibilities to establish stronger foreign relations. The creation of the Panama Canal was one of Roosevelt's most notable foreign relation accomplishments, as prior to its construction, ships had to make the 2-month-long voyage around South America from the Pacific into the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean. This was a fascinating thing, which honestly I'm going to need to go into here in the future when talking about the Panama Canal, but it was a bit messed up. Not gonna lie, like there's some really dark parts to it here. Roosevelt would begin negotiations with Britain in 1901 to establish a canal that was controlled by the U.S., and the Senate would approve plans for the canal, but Colombia had to be on board, which largely it was not at different points. It was very conflicted. The Hay-Bonal-Varilla Treaty was established in 1903, granting the U.S. permission to create the Panama Canal for $10 million and a $250,000 annual payment. In 1906, Roosevelt became the first president to leave the country while in office to visit Panama and oversee the canal's construction. This would ultimately cost $400 million and take 10 years to build, but was completed in 1914. And even now, to this day, the canal would prove to be a highly successful thing, something that would make passage between the seas separated by Central America much easier and drastically increasing commerce. At the same time that he would do this, Roosevelt was also a known peacemaker for his negotiation efforts on behalf of Russia and Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. He would go and convince the Russians and the Japanese leaders to meet in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905 in order to discuss disputes over Manchuria, which that's probably another thing that we're going to need to talk about at some point. Thanks to his role as mediator in the discussion, the Treaty of Portsmouth would officially end the Russo-Japanese War on September 5, 1905. Other negotiations would include disputes between Germany and France, which were about disagreements between France and their involvement in Morocco. A settlement between the two countries would end up getting reached in 1906, and these efforts are often recognized as preventing a world war from occurring earlier, which very well could have happened. Roosevelt did so many things, to the point that I don't even think that I could go into all of them. Like, even now, just talking about this, there are so many more things that we could do. If you all want an episode like that, that's going to be going into more things that he did and actions, please, by all means, really let me know. I do have to mention, before it is that we finish things off here or really get to the end, that there is the thing that everyone knows him for, his action with national parks. Using the Antiquities Act, Roosevelt established 150 national parks, or national forests, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reserves, and 4 national game preserves. Of the 230 million acres of federally protected lands, 150 million were established for national forests. In 1903, Roosevelt would meet with naturalist John Muir in order to explore Yosemite National Park, which expanded the park's acreage. Roosevelt would create the first national wildlife refuge in 1903 when he established Pelican Island in Florida. And this was a precursor to the establishment of the National Wildlife Refuge System. Roosevelt's conservation efforts were very important for the nation's future, as America was by this point turning into an extremely industrial society, which later created huge environmental concerns due to pollution and habitat destruction. Of course, as I said, there's no way I can cover everything. This episode would simply go on too long if I tried to do so. So then it brings us to the point of what was life like for Teddy after the presidency. Well, President Theodore Roosevelt would gain popularity among the people for his great efforts in dismantling monopolistic business practices that negatively affected consumers and focused on other social and economic issues that the nations faced. His aggressive approach to enforcing laws would ensure that fairness was above all and decisions were made for the benefit of the public, and it made him as to one of the most successful and popular presidents. When Roosevelt left office in 1909, he felt assured that he was leaving the nation in able hands. Roosevelt's successor was his friend, former Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Having enjoyed his travels in Europe and the Middle East with his family as a young boy, as well as his 2 years as a rancher in the Dakotas and countless hunting trips, it seemed only logical that Roosevelt's next move was to go on another nature adventure, an African safari. But after 2 years of collecting specimens, speaking engagements, and traveling, including as a special advisor to England for the funeral of King Edward VII, Roosevelt became extremely disgruntled with Taft's weak enforcement of progressive policies, and he decided, I'm going to go and do this again. I'm going to make another run for the presidency. To do so meant launching a third-party initiative, as Taft was running on the Republican Party ticket. So Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, and began campaigning for the 1912 election. While he was delivering a speech on the campaign trail in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he would ultimately be shot in the chest in an assassination attempt by John Nepomuk Schrenk. Shockingly, he survived. But not only would he survive, he would continue his speech for 90 minutes before seeing a doctor, later chalking up the incident to the hazards of the business. In the end, though, despite his great showing, Roosevelt would lose to Woodrow Wilson in the 1912 election, in a rather close popular vote. He considered running again in 1916, winning the Progressive nomination, but he bowed out in favor of the Republican Party nominee Charles Evans Hughes. His political aspirations, however, would soon prove to be far from over. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, he became very frustrated with Wilson's stance on neutrality and constantly would criticize the president's policy. When the U.S. finally declared war, Roosevelt requested permission to head a volunteer division for service in France in World War I, but he was turned down. Roosevelt would be proud, though, that all 4 of his sons would enlist for service during the war, even if he was heartbroken that his youngest son, Quentin, would end up dying in Germany. In the end, Roosevelt would die in his sleep on January 6th, 1919, at his Long Island estate on Sagamore Hill, after suffering a coronary embolism. He was 60 years old. This would be the end of Roosevelt, the man who'd be recognized as the first modern president of the United States. He is the guy who would set the precedent for what policies and reform would look like in future presidencies. And honestly, he is still to this day my favorite president. My friends, if you want to hear more about all the varying little things that he did, by all means, let me know in the comment section below. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to leave us a review here on Spotify, Apple, wherever it is that you are getting your podcast services. I thank you, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.